from homelessness to success. The true story of Chris Gardner. Imagine waking up every morning knowing you have almost no money, no home to return to, and a small child depending entirely on you. Now imagine that, while sleeping wherever you can find a safe place, you are still walking into some of the most prestigious financial offices in America, wearing the same clothes, carrying the same problems, and competing against people who seem to have everything. This was not the beginning of a movie. It was the reality faced by Chris Gardner, a man who went from struggling to survive with his young son to building a successful career in finance and becoming a multi-millionaire entrepreneur and motivational speaker. But the most incredible part of his story isn't the money. It's what happened when he had almost nothing. Welcome everyone, and before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us until the end, because this is a story about what can happen when a person refuses to give up the dream. Chris Gardner was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1954. His childhood was not an easy one. He grew up in circumstances where money was limited, and like many young people, he dreamed of building a better life for himself, but Gardner did not immediately know what that life would look like. As a young man, he served in the U.S. Navy. After leaving the military, he eventually moved toward a career in medical sales. For a time, Gardner appeared to be moving toward a stable future, but stability did not last. He eventually became involved in selling a medical device called a bone density scanner. Gardner believed strongly in the product. The machine was advanced for its time, but it was also expensive. Selling it was difficult, and Gardner quickly discovered that believing in something was not enough. He needed customers who could afford it. His financial situation became increasingly difficult. Then, one day, he saw something that would change the direction of his life. A man stepped out of a beautiful red Ferrari. Gardner was fascinated. He asked the man what he did for a living. The answer was simple. He was a stockbroker. Gardner wanted to know how he could become one. That conversation planted an idea in his mind. Perhaps finance was his way out. Perhaps this was the career that could change everything. But there was one enormous problem. Gardner had almost no money, and his life was already falling apart when everything collapsed. Gardner was also a father. His young son, Christopher, depended on him. The pressure became overwhelming. His relationship with his son's mother deteriorated, and eventually Gardner found himself responsible for raising his child while struggling financially. Bills accumulated, the medical scanners were difficult to sell, and the dream of becoming a stockbroker seemed almost impossible. Then Gardner faced another devastating problem. He became unable to keep up with his rent. Eventually, he and his young son were forced out of their home. Think about that moment. A father, a little boy, no stable home, very little money, and a dream that seemed almost ridiculous under the circumstances. But Gardner refused to abandon his son. He began searching for places where they could sleep. Sometimes that meant staying with friends. Sometimes it meant finding temporary accommodation, and sometimes there simply wasn't enough space. Gardner and his son experienced homelessness. This was one of the darkest periods of his life, but it was also the period in which his determination became strongest. The internship. Gardner had discovered that stockbrokers could build extremely successful careers, so he began searching for an opportunity. Eventually, he learned about an unpaid training program at the brokerage firm Dean Witter Reynolds. There was only one problem. The program was incredibly competitive, and it did not guarantee a job. Gardner would have to prove himself during the internship, compete with other candidates, and survive financially while receiving little or no income from the program. For someone who already had no home, this sounded almost impossible. But Gardner applied. He was accepted. Now his life became a race against time. Every day, he needed to learn. Every day, he needed to make calls. Every day, he needed to convince potential clients to trust him. And every evening, he still had to worry about where he and his son would sleep. Most people would have considered quitting. Gardner did not. He developed an extraordinary routine. He would arrive early. He would work relentlessly. He learned everything he could about the financial business. He understood that he could not afford to waste time. While others might make casual phone calls or take long breaks, Gardner tried to maximize every minute. He knew that the internship could be his only opportunity, the double life. During the day, Gardner was trying to look like a professional financial trainee. Outside the office, he was simply a father trying to keep his son safe. That contrast made his situation incredibly painful. Inside the office, he was surrounded by people wearing expensive suits and discussing investments. Outside, he was trying to find a place to sleep. He had to hide the full extent of his situation from the people around him. Imagine walking into a corporate office every morning and trying to convince wealthy clients that you understand money, while you yourself are struggling to afford food. That was Gardner's reality. But he kept going. His son became his motivation. Gardner did not want his child to believe that their circumstances defined their future. He wanted Christopher to understand that difficult circumstances could change, not immediately, not magically, but through persistence, discipline, and opportunity. The moment of truth. The internship continued. Gardner worked harder. He studied. He made calls. He searched for clients. He learned the financial markets. Slowly, people began to notice him. He was not the most privileged candidate. He did not have the strongest financial background. He did not have an impressive safety net. But he had something powerful. He was willing to work, and he refused to quit. Then came the moment that Gardner had been waiting for. The company had to decide who would receive a permanent position. For Gardner, this was not simply a career decision. It was the difference between continuing to struggle and finally having a chance to rebuild his life. He had spent months fighting for this opportunity. He had endured homelessness. He had cared for his son. He had continued working despite enormous pressure. And finally, he was told that he had earned the job. Gardner later described the moment as deeply emotional. After everything he had endured, he finally had a path forward. But his journey was far from over. Building a new life, Gardner began his career as a stockbroker. He worked hard and gradually became successful. Eventually, he moved beyond his first career and founded his own investment firm. The man who once struggled to find a place to sleep had entered the world of business. His financial situation changed dramatically, but Gardner did not forget where he came from. His experience with homelessness shaped the way he looked at success. For him, money was not simply about luxury. It represented freedom, security, and the ability to provide opportunities for his family. His story eventually reached millions of people around the world. He wrote his autobiography, The Pursuit of Happiness, which later inspired the famous film starring Will Smith. The movie introduced Gardner's story to an even larger audience, but the real-life journey was already extraordinary. A struggling father had survived homelessness and transformed his life through persistence. More than a story about money, it's easy to look at Chris Gardner's story and focus only on the ending, the successful businessman, the expensive suits, the financial career, the millions. But that misses the most important part. Success did not begin when Gardner got his first major paycheck. It began much earlier. It began when he decided that his circumstances would not determine his identity. He was poor, he was struggling, he was homeless, but he refused to believe that those words represented his entire future. And that is perhaps the most powerful lesson in his story. Sometimes, the distance between failure and success is not measured in money. It is measured in how many times you are willing to continue after life gives you a reason to stop. Gardner had many reasons to stop. He could have blamed his circumstances. He could have abandoned his dream. He could have decided that becoming a stockbroker was impossible. But instead, he kept showing up, day after day, call after call, application after application, opportunity after opportunity, until one finally changed his life, the legacy. Chris Gardner went on to become an entrepreneur, author, and motivational speaker. His life became an example frequently used to illustrate perseverance and resilience. His story also reminds us that people often see only the final chapter of someone's life. They see the success, they see the money, they see the achievements, but they rarely see the nights of uncertainty that came before them. They don't see the fear, they don't see the rejection, they don't see the sacrifices, and they don't see the moments when giving up seems like the easiest choice. Gardner's story became famous because millions of people recognized something familiar in it. the fear of failure, the pressure of responsibility, the desire to give your family a better life, and the hope that tomorrow can be different from today. His journey did not teach that success is guaranteed if you simply work hard. Real life is more complicated than that. But his story shows something else. When an opportunity appears, perseverance can determine whether you are ready to take it. The final question. Today, Chris Gardner's story is remembered as one of America's most inspiring stories of overcoming adversity. But imagine yourself in his position. You have a child depending on you. You have no permanent home. You have almost no money, and someone offers you an opportunity. But it requires months of sacrifice before you know whether it will succeed. Would you take that risk? Would you keep going when failure seemed more likely than success? Or would you choose security and abandon the dream? Because sometimes the hardest part of changing your life is not reaching the top. It is taking the first step when you cannot yet see the road ahead. So here's the question I want to leave with you. If you were in Chris Gardner's position, would you have continued fighting for your dream, or would you have given up? Tell me your answer in the comments, and remember, sometimes your current situation is only a chapter, not the ending of your story.